All participants will join the meeting with muted microphones. Please rename yourself to include your first name, last name, and affiliation. Participants can mute and unmute themselves. To participate in the discussion, please select the raise hand function. Find this by clicking on a participants button at the bottom of the screen, and a window will pop up with the raised hand button at the bottom or the reactions button in the toolbar. The presenters will then call on participants. If you are on the phone, you can use the *9 to raise your hand. If you have any technical difficulties, please contact Kate White via the chat box, kwhite@ctps.org or 857-702-3658. So I will call to order. Oh, let me read the accessibility statement. This meeting is accessible to people with disabilities. Zoom products are compliant with exceptions with the following standards: Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.1, Level AA standards, and revised Section 508 standards. Again, if you require any additional accommodations in order to participate fully in this meeting, please contact Kate White, MPO staff at kwhite@ctps.org or 857-702-3658. So I'm going to call to order the this kind of ad hoc MPO project cost committee. And why don't we start with introductions? I'm Eric Barassa with Metropolitan Area Planning Council. Do we want to just go around? Matt, you don't have a role, do you? Or
I don't. So we could probably just, I guess go around to committee members, and we'll just sort of be here as staff.
Here, why don't we see? Maybe I'll call on people just to make it go easy. Tom Bent.
Hi, good afternoon. Tom Bent, City of Somerville. What I'm hoping to get out of this committee is consistency in how we do things.
Great. Brian Kane.
Good afternoon, everybody. Brian Kane. I'm also hoping for consistency, but also interested in shaking things up a little bit in the out years after 26. So curious to see how this goes.
Okay. Ben Muller.
Ben Muller, mass.otp. Just here to, I guess, learn more about what the board members are thinking about the future of the TIP.
Okay. John Romano.
Hi, I'm John Romano from MassDOT, and I'm kind of here to see both consistency and, as Tom Bent said, maybe shake things up a little for future years to see if we can find a way to be able to get more projects done.
Okay. Jim Fitzgerald.
Hey, Jim Fitzgerald with City of Boston, BPDA. Like everyone else, just consistency, hopefully better capacity. I know that's easier said than done, and better accuracy with the cost estimating. So thank you.
Thank you. Len Diggins.
Len Diggins here, Advisory Council. I'm here to learn how to make better sausage. And we just really want to avoid a situation like we had in this current cycle of the TIP, and just figure out how better to work with the communities who really depend on us being able to deliver projects to them or deliver the monies for them to do their projects. Thank you.
Thanks, Len. Jay Monty.
Good afternoon, Jay Monty with the City of Everett. I think for me, this is really, I want to have an honest conversation about kind of the process. I think there's been some assumptions about why costs keep going up, but I don't know that they're the correct assumptions. And I think just kind of an honest airing of opinions and ideas to that end.
Great. Are those all the members? Peter, are you a member of the ad hoc committee? Okay, Peter Pelletier.
Hi, Pete Pelletier. Honestly, I volunteered to help with the cost overruns, obviously, and maybe I have some input. I'm hoping I have some bright ideas, but we'll see if they come to me. And also just to better understand the MPO and stuff and how everything works, because I'm fairly new to this and I just wanted to kind of get more entrenched into everything so I could be a more contributing factor.
Great. I think that's everyone on the committee, correct? I guess I will just maybe conclude by saying that, I'm actually very interested in having some discussion about, what are the things that drive cost, but I'm most interested in sort of developing some type of policy for how the MPO reacts to that, and how we're very clear with the public and with our municipalities about what our options and what we might do when a project goes up in cost. Personally, I'm less interested in trying to somehow convince MassDOT to do or figure out how to get MassDOT to do a better job of, of managing projects or keeping costs down. I feel like some of those things are kind of outside of our control, at least in the short term. Now, if that's actually what the group wants to discuss, that might be something we need to think about for like longer term. But I'm interested in having a discussion about what are the things that the MPO can kind of do vis-a-vis our own process. And then if we are making a policy or implementing something, at least for this next tip cycle next year, that we do so in such a way that we give enough time to the public and our cities and towns about what we might do if projects go up in cost, and even do like a public comment period so that it's very transparent and clear about what we're doing. So those are some of my my thoughts. I think we do have time for public comment right now. So if there are any members of the public that want to provide input, now is the time to do that. We can also, take questions as we go through the regular process as well, after members have had the opportunity. But if there are any members of the public that wish to say anything, please raise your hand. Let's see, Catherine.
Thank you. Catherine Bowen from Belmont, Massachusetts. I serve in Belmont as a town meeting member and a school committee member, and also on the Community Path Project Committee. I'm here in my capacity as a member of the Path Project Committee. And I wondered if you could address the question that came up recently in one of our meetings, to do with a notion that a policy would be looking for towns to make up an unanticipated cost for projects that go on the tip. So I don't know that you might have the answer for that today, but I just wanted to bring it to your attention. This is an idea that's, I guess, floating around at this stage. And so I'm hopeful that any kind of misinformation can be addressed and get more clarity as I listen to your meeting. So thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you. I mean, I think that's something we're going to discuss over the course of this committee's, meetings. So I think that will be a topic that will come up, and we'll discuss that.
Thank you.
Any other public comments? Okay. Catherine, you can take your hand down. Seeing any others, why don't I hand it over to Matt to give kind of a little bit of a framing for the following discussion.
Sure, thanks, Eric. I don't have a ton of formal talking points, but mostly just wanted to take a minute to just get us all on the same page with sort of, how this meeting can progress, and then, generally sort of where we go from here. So I think, one of the main goals, at least from the staff perspective for today, is to understand your needs as a committee and to understand the support that we can provide as MPO staff in terms of research, bringing, information or other resources to you all to work with as you have your committee meetings. So we are sort of at your disposal as staff members. So I think that, just getting a sense of direction on where you'd like to see these conversations go, at least over the next handful of weeks, but, ideally sort of in the longer run as well over the next few months. So that's really, from the staff perspective, sort of our main goal for today. So we have these questions here that are fairly loose, that can really just sort of, start the conversations or get you all thinking on sort of different parts of the work ahead of this committee. And so, our thought was to have this be sort of a relatively open discussion among committee members. Eric, obviously, if you, as the chair, if you want to sort of guide this, that's fine. Otherwise, we can sort of co-guide as staff and chair. And we also do have a Jamboard set up to take some notes so we can sort of follow along with the conversation as it goes, so folks can see sort of the ideas that are being put on the table, if that's helpful. Yeah, so I can sort of stop there, and then,
So we have, I know there's someone calling into, we have 5 questions, essentially, how do you define the current problem as it relates to project cost increase? What are your goals for this committee's work? What does success look like for this committee? That's 3. 4 is what background research or resources would be helpful for this committee's work? And 5 is what should this committee focus on in its second meeting? So I think the first question is really important, because I think how we define kind of the problem is if we can get consensus on that, then I think kind of the next questions in terms of like, what do we need to do and how do we solve that problem, I think kind of flow from that. So maybe we could go around and we could just see what people think in terms of, what do you think is the problem? I have my own perspective, but I'm happy to hold that and see if others, want to go first. Brian Kane.
So Eric, thank you. I'm just looking back through my notes here from the MPO's March 18th meeting. And, that was when we were wrestling with cost overruns and everything being out of whack. And I said at the time, according to what I wrote down here, that I don't think anything should change for projects already 22 to 26. But starting in 27, the status quo, how we fund things needs to change. So, one thing that I'll just throw out there, do we really feel like we always have to fund 100% of projects? It's a question. I would love possibly to see a scenario where we funded certain projects at tiered levels. If projects were higher in equity and moving, EJ areas, for instance, they could get 100% funded, whereas projects in some of the whitest, wealthiest communities could maybe get less funding or 80% funded, in combination by the state and the MPO. So I think to sort of get to the current problem is that funding every year of the TIP 100% leaves us no room to adjust when costs go up, and costs always go up. And so I'm trying to think of ways to give the MPO more wiggle room to deal with those overruns, and also, as was said, to do more projects in more communities. And I do believe that if we could do more projects, maybe not at 100%, that, we could get a lot more done across this region. So I'll leave it at that.
Okay, thank you, Brian. John Romano.
Thank you, Eric. So I think, trying to define the current problem is, I think the thing that we continue to struggle with is how do we get to the point that some of the initial numbers that we get on these projects, how are they so far out of whack from by the time we actually put these out to bid? And I think we started to scratch the surface of that this year. I think John Bouchard did a great job with trying to explain some of that. And I think, maybe kind of defining the current problem with looking at question 4 with background research maybe looking back over, and I'm not sure how many years to go back, right? I'll leave that out there to see, you know, how many, like what type of projects have had the biggest overruns, you know, and where that was defined. You know, is the problem because we maybe score projects too early? You know, are we accepting projects before 25% design? Maybe 25% design is too early. I don't know, but that's what I think where the problem we need to look at is where is the cost overrun happening? And when do we get a better sense of what the real cost of the project is? Because if we have the real cost of the project, regardless of where it is in the cycle, that's when we have a better idea. So if we know a project's 100 million, then we know that's what it is, and we can decide whether we want to fund it, whether we want to fund part of it. You know, that's to me, that's where I see where the problem is.
Okay. Kind of the cost estimating and kind of when does the increase occur? You know, if we're funding something pre 25%, and then if really at 25% is when we know a better sense. So understanding that a little bit better vis-a-vis our sort of decision making process.
Right. And Eric, if I could add one more point, it seemed towards the end of the tip discussion, we learned that maybe there's the consultant not knowing that when we assign a number, there's then the other additional MassDOT costs that they might not be including. We need to really get to the bottom of that and see if, because that is a significant amount of money added on. And you know, certainly John Bouchard and those guys are carrying those costs. You know, that's not a surprise. That should not be a surprise cost to anybody. So I think we need to make sure that's being added in right from the beginning, because that's a significant difference.
Okay, thank you, John. I'm going to go to Jay Monty.
Yeah, I think I'll add on to both John's comments, and I think one of the issues I see is a sort of there's not clarity on where the accountability is in the process, whether it's MassDOT, whether it's the city. It's not to say that we're going to have cost overruns. I think that's a inevitability of the process. But one of the things that happens is we all stay committed to funding a project for a city or town because of the fact that this town puts in all the upfront costs. I think to Brian's earlier point about you know, better cost sharing arrangements. You know, the reality is that cities and towns do put in probably a good 10, 15, 20% of the total cost of the project. But that funding comes at the very front end of the project through design, through right-of-way acquisition, through permitting. And so at that point, you know, we as the board always feel committed then to honor those expenses by the town. But at the same time, MassDOT and the MPO have not expended any funds at that point. So, you know, I agree with Brian. I think the cost sharing is a good thing, but one of the problems is that we kind of lopsided to either end, and it clouds our ability to make a good decision about whether that project should continue. Because by the time we're, you know, faced with funding the construction, how do you say to a town that's already spent? I mean, I think on Ferry Street we've spent upwards of $4 or $5 million, probably more, into that project, and you know, if the MPO were to come around and say, well, you know what, at $35 million, we don't really want to fund that anymore. You've asked the city or town to spend a pretty large sum of money. So I'd like to, I think that problem is like where there should be some more joint accountability throughout the process. So it's not all the city and town up front. It's not all MassDOT at the end. And that there's just some more shared interest at all levels of the project. I think that's, in my view, one of the issues today. There will still be cost overruns. I have no doubt that there will be, but I think we'll better address them and manage them if all the parties have a equal stake in the process throughout the process, not at different points.
Thank you, Jay. I'm going to go to Len.
Thanks. Eric, I mean, essentially, I agree with John and Jay. I mean, and essentially, we just need to get a better handle on the costs, so that we know what to expect with respect to monies to spend, because we don't want to be in a situation where we have to claw money back, from a project in the next year or two when that municipality is planning on it. And so if we need to keep a buffer, actually, I'm just going to stay with the problem instead of solutions at this point, and I'm just going to focus on question one. So that's it. Thanks.
All right. Thank you, Len. Tom Bent.
Again, thanks, Eric. Listening to Jay and John, Brian, agree with just about all what they had to say. But I thought the surprise this time around was, we did get hit with a lot of last minute cost increase from MassDOT. And my question on that is why wasn't that brought into the numbers a lot earlier on? And maybe there should be a checklist so that when we get these requests, that we can see, the staff can come back to us and say, yeah, these individual costs are all in there, so that we know what we're approving. And the other thing, like Jay said, the cities and towns are putting a lot of money up front, and $4 or $5 million may not seem like a lot, but it is a lot to those cities and towns. And maybe one of the solutions there would be trying to share that with MassDOT earlier on, so everybody's got skin in the game earlier on. But I think, and this has just been such a recurring problem. The other thing too is I think we need to look at the 4% inflation that we're just automatically calculating. That's been the same all for the 10 or 12 years I've been on the MPO. It's never changed. And this year, construction inflation is quite high. So I think MassDOT should be looking at that too, and maybe tie it into some kind of rate or that's out there. But I think that's part of the problem too, that 4% may not be enough. And then the last thing may be looking at, one of the big drivers on a lot of these projects are police details. And, what kind of control do we have over that? Or what does, MassDOT have control over that? And I know we experienced this recently on the new high school project in Somerville, that our own police details were huge on that project, a lot more than what we had anticipated. So, and I think that, I bet if we went down and look at a breakdown on a lot of these projects, we'd probably see that too. So it's a few things there.
Thanks, Tom. Ben Muller.
Thanks, Eric. Yeah, I agree. I want to pick up on something Jay was talking about following a project through its life cycle. I think there's a lot of talk of sort of general costs, but if we look at the scenarios from this year, it was actually just a handful of projects with very large cost increases or delays that kind of drove the numbers. And I think if we had some way of better identifying those high risk projects sort of earlier on, understanding their risks, understanding, hey, they're falling behind. Because right now, the only real check in that process at the Boston MPO is sort of the readiness days exercise and the follow-up that CTPS does with the towns after that to sort of identify what those risks are. Whereas I think if you look at what some of the other MPOs that have tackled this issue in the Commonwealth have done, is they've really started this sort of year-round process of following where staff are working with the towns to identify those risks early on and communicate them to the board.
Okay, Ben, that's interesting. Let's put a bookmark on that. I'd like to hear more about what maybe some of the other MPOs do in Massachusetts with that respect. Ken Miller.
Thanks, Eric. I think that one of the major issues is that there is no incentive for a designer, and that could be a municipally designed project or even a state design project. There is no incentive for a designer to keep the costs down. In fact, there is a pretty big incentive to make the project as big, the scope as big as possible. Once a project is approved by MassDOT and has a number, and there's a chance that it's going to get funded by the MPO. There is no, municipality may say, look, this is our chance to get a project on the tip every 10 years or whatever it may be. Guess what? We're going to put as much as we can in that project. And guess what? And from a design or even from a consultant point of view, consultants make more money when the project is bigger and the scope is bigger. So there's no incentive on anybody's part to, other than the MPO, because you want to be able to do more projects and you want to spread the money around. There's no incentive on any particular proponent to keep the cost down. And I think one of the things that could be helpful again is to actually look at unit. I've been suggesting now for years. I did a very quick take on the bike that are currently on the tip, and they range from a unit cost of $2.6 million a mile to about $5 million a mile. And not to pick on any particular community, but the Belmont Community Path is $12 million a month, for example, based on my calculation. So I think those kinds of, and that's not to say that it's a bad project, but that kind of information I think will be helpful in asking logical questions as to why projects are what they are. And I think it relates to lack of incentive to keep costs down. I'll just point out one more thing. In terms of municipalities designing projects and the costs that they expend up front, yes, that's a huge issue. I think there's an equity issue there. Communities that have wealthier communities, perhaps, have the ability to, design projects more on spec than other municipalities may have do. There is nothing that prevents federal funding from being used for design. This MPO could decide to fund design for worthwhile projects if it chooses. There's nothing that prevents federal funds for being used for project development. Thank you.
Thank you, Ken. Yeah, I mean, I also feel that a part of the problem, and I too would be very interested in improving the sort of the cost, figuring out how the cost estimating could be better and how we could, and if that's something the MPO has sort of control or influence over, and kind of when we make decisions in the process, I'd be very interested to dig into that, and if that's like a part of the problem. But going back to Ken's point, I also think a part of the problem is that we don't incorporate cost into our scoring and our evaluation of projects. And so when we approve a project and it goes up in cost, we don't have a way of sort of reevaluating it and saying like, okay, we like that project when it was 10 million. Do we still think it's a good project when it's 15 or 20 million? And I'd be interested in figuring out how to incorporate sort of like a cost, benefit into it in some ways, so that there's an ability to kind of rescore a project when it does go up in cost, so that we could then be able to compare that to something, compare that project to other projects that we might not have approved yet for the tip, but we might say like, those are better. So that's something I'd like to throw out there, is sort of building off of what Ken said, that we don't include cost into that. And I think that gets to some of his points about then kind of the incentives for, designers to take that into account. Jay Monty.
So I'm going to push back on Ken a little bit, and I actually completely agree with him that the incentive structure is kind of out of whack here, as he described. But where I'm going to push back is to say I'm going through the TIP document from March, and some of the biggest cost increases were not municipal projects; they were MassDOT projects. Not to say there weren't increases on the municipal side, there were, and I agree to some extent with the points Ken made about that. But I think this issue is not specific to municipalities run amok. I think this is much larger than that. I'm looking at a MassDOT project in Norwood that had a $13.5 million cost increase due to expanded project limits, right? So a clear scope increase by the proponent, in that case, MassDOT, right? So this is across the board. This is not specific to municipalities. But again, I agree that the incentives to pack more into projects because you can, Ken's absolutely right. And so I think somewhere in the process here, where the folks making either the scoping decisions and the funding decisions aren't connected somewhere, and whether that's because we're not sharing the process as closely as we should, we're not sharing the cost of design as closely as we should, or we're not sharing the decision making as closely as we should. I think those are probably all true to some extent, but it's not specific to municipalities by any means.
Okay, thanks, Jay. Ben?
Yeah, thanks, Jay. I think to add to that, after last year's STIP, we had a lot of cost increases on the statewide side. So we ran sort of an internal analysis. So we were looking at sort of where projects were being held up because there are some readiness issues and where costs were going up. And essentially we found that the largest driver on our side of increases happened for projects that had a big delay between the 25th and the 75th percentile submission. So a lot of the projects we were seeing were getting sort of a 25 percentile when they were programmed, or sort of, when they were 4 or 5 years out, and then they'd get a 75% submission 3 or 4 years later. And at that point, maybe some policies have changed, maybe some priorities have changed, maybe some local elected officials have changed. And so the process of getting over that design bump sort of led to a lot of add-ins or a lot of changes or a lot of adjustments to the project that weren't really happening for projects that were moving quicker or more smoothly. So I think that is something that we want to keep an eye on, as sort of that lag time where, if we're seeing projects starting to lag behind in the design milestones, that's probably indicative that they're high risk for also cost increases, in addition to sort of the typical readiness problems.
Okay, thank you. Ken, did you want to add another point? You still have your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to say I agree with Jay 100%. I didn't mean to suggest that it was only a municipal problem. In fact, on the state side, if you think about a district office or the different components of MassDOT as a municipality, it's the same kind of thing. Districts, it does the same thing. Hey, it's their one, they get a project on the tip and they're going to load it up too. And so, yeah, so I didn't mean to suggest, Jay, that it doesn't apply to state design projects also. And I'll just add, I think there's also an issue at MassDOT of so much of a focus on advertising and schedule now that there's not much of a focus on budget for a particular project. And the folks at MassDOT, correct me if I'm wrong, but and my recollection, and even from what I see now, is that project managers don't get jammed up because prices because the estimates went up. They get jammed up because something happened with the schedule. Whereas if you go to other state DOTs, boy, they're told to design to a number, and if the number goes up, there's hell to pay, and it's just a different kind of, I guess, priority in different organizations.
Okay, that's interesting. Len.
Thank you, Eric. I mean, this was a question back to Ben, just to explain. It's probably matter just repeating what you said about what's the cause for delays again between that 25th and 75th percent.
There's a few different ones, so it's not really consistent across projects.
Right.
But a lot of times, a lot of times a project will just kind of lag a bit because it's not due to advertise for a while, and so a town will kind of wait, or MassDOT will kind of wait on progressing the design because what's the point in spending energy here when you can spend energy there? So there's kind of a capacity issue there, both at MassDOT and at the municipal side. But sometimes the projects are just very complex, or more complex than we expected. More things pop up at the 25th. So there's a bunch of different things that kind of contribute to that lag. But when there is a lag, we found that the costs tend to rise and the project tends to get delayed. And so that's sort of the thing that we've been trying to keep an increasing eye on because it tends to point to other problems with the project.
All right, Ben, thank you.
So I want to summarize a little bit about kind of what I've heard. I've been taking notes, and kind of what I've heard here is a lot of talk about, are there things that can be better done at the beginning around cost estimating? And so a lot of those things could be the responsibility, of the municipalities, designers, kind of MassDOT. So one problem is around cost estimating. Another problem I think we've identified is kind of this incentive for cost control. And that could be another area that we could kind of dig in. Like, well, how do we create incentives for cost control? Ken's highlighted a couple things, everything from the designers and the municipalities to sort of, culture at MassDOT and things like that. A third one I heard was just kind of like the project oversight and the potential to identify high risk projects that Ben has identified, like as they're going through the process, when there's this lag time, having staff being more aware of what's going on, so we can kind of catch these projects earlier. So project oversight being a third one. Tom brought up more deeper dive into investigating like elements of these projects that might be driving costs, like police details. I honestly don't know how much control we're going to have over those kinds of issues, but I want to highlight, Tom, what you said there. And then I felt like Brian kind of kicked it off with even a different issue, which is sort of like a problem of, or maybe even like not even necessarily a problem, but like an opportunity to say, like, could we spread these resources more widely if we required more, matching from cities and towns, which to me almost feels like a different issue, but I wanted to, make sure that was included here. Do folks feel like I've captured that into those kind of like themes? Do you think we're missing anything here? I get a thumbs up from Len, thumbs up from Tom. Okay, so I think we kind of have like a few buckets of like what we think the problems are. Moving on to number two, I mean, I think the goal for this committee is to try to come up with some set of recommendations. Do folks, I feel like, I could see a set of recommendations being, here's some things that like, the MPO we can do, like as the MPO board, here's recommendations we're going to make, to kind of MassDOT, designers. We can't necessarily control that, but I don't know, what do folks think about, and just in terms of like how we want to tackle these issues and come up with potential solutions?
Eric, you looking for specific policy recommendations, or you're just looking for?
No, I'm sort of thinking like, do we want to try to address everything and say like, okay, we want to come up with a set of recommendations that we're really hoping MassDOT and like cities and towns and designers will implement. We're gonna focus on things that the MPO, and this could be or we're gonna focus on just like the things the MPO has control over. So we're gonna, we're just gonna focus on the point at which the MPO makes like decisions for when projects are on the tip. We're just gonna focus on the ability, for the MPO to incorporate maybe cost or incentive into like the scoring, or we're going to try to figure out, is there a role that we can play? And this is where I'd be very interested to hear from Ben Muller about, project kind of oversight from the MPO staff level, and kind of what that entails and how much time and what that means. We're obviously different than other MPOs because we have hundreds and dozens of projects where some MPOs only have a few that are in their kind of pipeline. But I guess that's what I'm kind of trying to get a sense from folks. Like, do we want to try to cover all of these things, or do we want to just hone in on a subset of them? Len, you have your hand raised.
Well, you know what? You wanted to hear from Ben. So let's see if Ben wants to chime in, and then I'll chime in after him.
Yeah, Ben.
Yeah, I think just thinking about how other MPOs have sort of addressed a similar problem is a lot of them have set up sort of a milestone process for sort of expected project status by program year. So sort of in year 5 of the tip, we won't program a project unless it's received X design milestone, and so on and so forth through the process. The 2 biggest examples of this would be the Southeast Mass region and the Cape Cod region. So Southeast Mass has had a policy for 2 years now, where if the project is not, I believe it's if it hasn't received a 25% submission, they won't put it into the 5th year. And then they have sort of a progressive milestone process throughout. And then they have one of their tip staff members sort of follows up with the district. They only work with one district, so it's a little easier for them to maintain sort of a local database of project status and check it with the town when they think there's something running behind. So a lot of that's just, oh, there's a milestone, let's call and see if they hit it, right? Or let's just check in project info and see if they made that milestone. And if we're not seeing it, then we can bring it up to the district in an email or a phone call or something to that effect. Cape Cod MPO put in a little more aggressive work into theirs. So they had their sort of RTAC equivalent, which is mostly public works directors, talk about their process and designs and what their big milestones are and what their local barriers are, and identify very specific milestones for design year. And then they formally adopted those. And so now all of their tip recommendations include a where is the project on these design milestones? Has it achieved it? Has it not? Basically just kind of a green, this project's on schedule, yellow, this project we don't think is on schedule, and red, you really shouldn't program this project in PO, but here it is. And so it kind of lends a little bit of risk assessment to the programming process. What that would look like for the Boston MPO is, of course, a little different. Southeast Mass is a relatively large region. So they have sort of 20 odd million every year they program, and about half the number of projects that the Boston MPO has. But it would be something that we'd have to develop locally that would be responsive to what our towns are looking to accomplish and what our barriers might be. And it would require sort of ensuring that that staff is on hand internally to manage that process and to watch those design milestones.
Can I ask just one question? And maybe we can discuss more of this at another meeting. But one question is, do they ever like say, okay, you're not ready, you've gone way up in cost, you're off? Like, do they ever kick people off the tip? Like, do other MPOs do that at all?
There's been one case in Southeast Mass where they kicked the project off the tip after the town meeting didn't vote for their right-of-way authority. And so the MPO said, you know what, even though you're a couple of years out, we're going to take you out until you figure this out, because we're not sure what year you'll be ready for, and the project doesn't seem to be working. Cape Cod MPO most recently had a project where, because they only get 10 million a year, the project had risen to about 35 million. And so they were, sort of worried they would only have this one project. So they worked with the town to essentially phase the project so they could break it into manageable pieces for their budget. So they were able to advertise one element this year, and then the second half of that project they programmed in the 5th year into 2026 this year.
Okay, that's interesting. Thank you, Ben. Jay.
So I would really like to get at the issue of the cost sharing, and not necessarily changing the share that the proponent pays versus the federal government pays. I think 10 or 20%. I think that's a good benchmark. But the timeline in which that money gets spent by the parties, and I appreciate Ken's comment about we choose not to use federal funds to do design, but we could, and I think it may actually be a very good thing to use federal funds for design, because I think until that, we'll never vote a project off the tip that a town has funded millions in design and right of way and spent untold political capital in their community. It's a rare occurrence when we've ever pulled somebody off the tip, no matter how expensive the project got, how complicated it got. And I think you might chip away at that issue if you set the process in a way that the town wasn't on the hook for at least the initial design, right? That they didn't feel they had as much skin in the game until the thing's actually ready to get built. I think that would meaningfully change the dynamic. And same goes for, MassDOT projects. So I'm not singling out municipalities or anybody else, but the other thing too, which I think you could, if we made, I think, a pretty good assumption that design is, 15% of construction costs, and the MPO were to hold off that 15%, we may actually be able to design a few more projects than we do today, which would allow us to more easily program projects in the near term, where today we have this issue where we keep, something runs, isn't ready, and we're always trying to fill holes in the tip. I think it might allow us to have a few more projects on hand to slide in on the shorter term, and it would lessen the, I think the desire to program, a full 5 years tip, right? So you may only need to program 2 years out, knowing that you've got all these other projects in the pipeline, but we're not going to really evaluate them and decide on them until they're designed. And, by the MPO assuming the cost of design, I think it takes at least some of the politics out of the process.
Len.
Yeah, well, I was holding off, on saying what Jay said, for later on in the conversation, but I agree 100% with that. And it would give us a lot more control over the situation. It would give us a way to bring our metrics in, which we could use to emphasize whatever we want. And I think there's a big emphasis on equity, and with respect to the goal, maybe I'm just being a little too broad, but essentially the goal, at least in the short run, is to bring back to the full committee some kind of plan so that we don't end up in this situation again, because we were just shocked. That's why this committee is here, and we don't want the committee to be shocked when it gets to the next tip. So that's it. Thanks.
Yeah, I agree. Ken Miller.
Just quickly to follow up with what Ben said about other MPOs in Pioneer Valley a while ago, maybe Ben, this predates your time, but there was a project in a small town that was going to use up the entire Pioneer Valley MPO target money, a project that on a very low ADT road, went from 4 million to 5 million to 7 million to 10 million. And the MPO said, you know what, you're getting $7 million, figure it out. And the town did. And so there are, you can't tell people to do design to a number at some point. So, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Ken. Brian Kane.
Thanks, Eric. So looking at this, I break it down in my own mind into two sort of groups. There's the supply side and the demand side, right? So the demand, as I understand it, as I see it in our region, is almost infinite. There is an infinite demand for transportation projects and money for transportation projects. And, if we were Dubai and had unlimited funds, every city and town would be doing something, I think. The MPO is really the supply funding place, or one of the main ones. And to sort of answer one of your initial questions, Eric, I just think that the only way that we can come at this is from the supply side. And I'm not a supply side economist by any, or subscribe to those theories, but I think in this case it makes sense. We have to, as an MPO, put some limits on, or some boundaries or some bans on what we will fund and what we will not fund. And otherwise, there's no incentive for anybody to just to stop their demand. I think what Ken just said about the Pioneer Valley is really interesting. Here's what you get, and I'm pretty sure if that were the case, cities and towns and agencies and whatnot would figure it out. And they might not do everything they want, but they probably will do something that is sufficient. And there's nothing wrong with that. So, I think we need to be in the business of putting limits. I think we need to be in the business of not funding things 100%. And I think we need to, start to kind of get tough a little bit. Thanks.
Thanks, Brian. Tom Bent.
Again, I agree with a lot that was just said. I think, but going back to your initial question on the goals, you had basically laid out two different items, and I think it's going to be a mix of both. I think you can't do one without the other, and we have to look at what Brian just said, as the supply side, but also on the other side, as far as how we handle or how we review how the projects have kind of come up through the pipeline and what's included and what isn't, and all that. I know, I'm in the construction field, and I know we have to live and die on a budget, and to get a change order is really hard to do. So, and one of the thoughts I've had too is, when we see these projects grow in size, and I know I've asked the question a few times, has anyone looked at value engineering issues and things like that to try to, knock this number down? And I think the feeling may be out there that, well, we got them this far, there's no way they're going to say no to us. So I'm wondering is ultimately, do we come up with a percentage increase and say, if a project goes more than a certain percentage, we're not going to fund it. You'll either have to fund it yourself or it'll come off the tip. Again, it's part of what Brian's saying, maybe getting tough with some of these things, but that would also send a message to the consultants and the designers of these projects that they don't have a, just a free boat here to design whatever they want. So, but I think it's a mix of both sides of that equation that you brought up earlier.
Yeah, no, thank you, Tom. I would be interested, I think for today's meeting is really an opening. I think we're trying to understand like where's everyone coming from, and then we can kind of hone in on like, how do we then start to talk about, solutions or what recommendations that we're going to be making as a committee at our next meeting. But I would be interested in at least, today, like hearing from people, since this has come up from a few different folks about this idea of, kind of what Ken said and what Brian and now Tom had reiterated, like, if a project goes up in cost, we might just say, sorry, like, we committed to $10 million and that's it. Like, you find the rest, somewhere else. Maybe folks can think about that, because that's obviously a very neat, very straightforward, policy is just to say, at some point we're just going to say, this is the money that we're committing to. John Romano, what were you going to say?
I just want to add in, before we get, kind of caught up on saying, this is your number. I think we need to, roll back again and look at where we get to that number, because not all cost increases are bad cost increases. If we're not, we go back to what I said earlier, we need to look at where we are when we come up with that number. Mm-hmm. If it's after 25% design, so, we have a design public hearing at 25%, we get input from the community. If the cost increases because of scope creep, because we want to make everybody happy, right? Because we got 50 comments at the public hearing and everybody wants to add a whole bunch of stuff. Well, maybe that's where you draw the line and say, well, we were going to give you 10 million, but now you want to be able to add all this extra stuff, to make your community happy. We can't give you another 5 million, right? But if there is a reason, if there's a design reason, and we're still within the same scope and nothing creeped, right? But we found but the designers found a problem, and that's now going to cost another $1 million to fix. And it's nobody's fault. It's just because as the design progressed, they found the problem. I think those are different cost increases. The same with, the number that we get, is that all is it all in? Is that all the numbers? Do we have all the numbers, or did somebody forget that we got the 10% that MassDOT has to add on? I think we need to just be sure we're checking all of that. Somebody mentioned about a checklist, right? When somebody gives us a number, we have a checklist and say, are all 10 of these things included in that number? If they're not, then we're not going to talk about this till you go back and get those costs, so we know the real number. So I think we need to get to the real number. I think that's critical.
No, those are good points. Jay Monty.
Yeah, actually, John, you've got at what I was going to say. I think we have this tendency often to think about these cost increases as somebody must have just wanted more in their project, and there is some of that, to be sure. But from my own observation, I think majority of it is the latter, which is what John described. You start doing test pits and getting into design, and you find a utility that needs to be replaced, or you find soil that's not structurally sufficient, or in our case in Everett, we were going to, it was scoped as mill and overlay, and then turned out between all the utilities and the old trolley tracks, the comments came back from MassDOT that it needs to be full depth. So those aren't nice to have scope increases. Those are engineering determinations. And I think my hesitation with the kind of get tough attitude is that is that fair in a situation where it wasn't the city or town simply asking for more? It was a real engineering reason that something needed to change. And does that in turn justify doing less work elsewhere? I don't know. Is that even possible given the type of project? Again, I think it points back to, are we making a decision to fund a project too early? And should we be waiting longer to make that decision? I don't think most of the cost increases are simply, we want, more bike lanes and more, fancy street furniture.
Thank you, Jay. Len.
So it all comes down to context. And so I want to kind of temper my response to my distaste for the get tough approach, because I much prefer to work with people than to get tough with them. And this is where the context comes in, because we could all be meaning different things by that. And I like the notion of us, the MPO, designing to a number. And saying, okay, this is the need for the community. You bring this project to us, this is the need. We design for that. We have a number in mind, and then we say to the community, this is it. And then the community, we can say to the community, if you want more, you're going to have to put up more money for it. You can make the case for why we should maybe add more to it. If they convince us, then fine, we do that. If they don't, then they take that on. But we want to work with them, so that we don't have to get tough, and then yank a project, because yanking a project, should be considered a failure. And so, once again, it's the context. So we all may be meaning the same thing, but I really want to work with people more than get tough with them. Thanks.
Right. Ben Muller.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out we do have a process to sit down and discuss when a project's gone over by a certain amount, whether we still want to fund it through the TIP amendment process. And it's, got a public comment period attached, and it's all public record. And we have the opportunity to ask questions of the town then, and of the highway division, and of the district then, and get some background on the project. But I think just given sort of the history of how the MPO meetings work, how much is on the table every meeting, when the TIP development cycle pops up, a lot of those TIP amendments kind of get held into, okay, well, we'll save that for the TIP development cycle, because we don't have time to do a TIP amendment while we're doing all of this other work. So there might be an opportunity in there to reevaluate how we approach the TIP amendment process, and making sure that we have space to ask those questions, and that the people who can answer those questions are in the room when we do ask them.
That's a good point, Ben, because I think one of the things personally that I experience when we do the TIP development process, every kind of, spring, is it feels like the frustration I feel is that there's so many moving parts, and it feels like when these projects go up in cost, we're like losing control. Like there's like our budget, and we're not really sure about cost and readiness, and so now we're like starting to bump things, and then we have and then there aren't necessarily things ready that can fill that space. So I like when it all happens in that one kind of process, it just feels like there's so many moving parts going on. And then on top of all the meetings, we have an hour of public comment and people coming in saying, please don't move my project. And it is interesting to maybe even think about our own process for that vis-a-vis tip amendments. I wrote that down as another sort of another point to think about. Other kind of thoughts here, just in general about what we want to accomplish. What do we think the problems are? What do we think are some of the for future meetings? Is there information or research within reason that could be done? Brian Kane.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. I have a couple of research suggestions. Yeah, as has been discussed, those projects on the last few tips that have gone over, what type are they, what mode are they, what region, that sort of stuff. See if we can find out any common factors. If there are MPOs that fund design, what are their factors for determining who gets funded for design? I'm just worried that if we start funding design, we'll just have this all over again, just for design, which, we can do, but I just want to know sort of what that is. I think AASHTO publishes an annual inflation or estimates an inflation rate every year or for the out years. I'm just, is there a good benchmark to consider against sort of the 4% that we use? And then really more of a feasibility question for the CTPS folks. What is feasible in terms of project check-ins other than the tip readiness day? Is it feasible to consider with current constraints and staffing, quarterly, biannually, whatever? What could be done? And I do want to just again throw out there, I do think that there is a difference between a bike path in a wealthy white community and a transit project in an EJ community. And I think it's okay for the MPO to fund them at different rates. And I do just want to throw out there again, the concept of tiered funding based on our scoring criteria or whatever criteria we develop that would allow us to do more projects in more places. And again, I want to be very clear. I'm only suggesting this starting after 26. So thank you.
Brian, thank you. Let's Matt and CDPSF, why don't we just like take all these research questions and even if you might have responses now, why don't we have those for the next meeting? We can just kind of catalog everything right now. Does that sound good? Okay, Jay.
Just real quick, so, I think it was about 2 years ago, we had some folks come in from Virginia and talk about their system of funding projects at MPO. And it seemed to get a lot of interest from members of this board. Obviously, it would be a pretty big departure from the way we do things now, but this seems like it's a good opportunity to maybe, circle back with those folks in that presentation to see maybe, you mentioned, changes to our process, and I think that's really what it gets at. Are there things we could adopt from that system in Virginia that might help us alleviate some of these issues?
Right. So are there other MPO, in addition to MPOs in Massachusetts, which, Ben and the MassDOT staff might be able to, shed more light on, are there other MPOs that are dealing with these issues too, that we could draw on? There might be a larger body of work, but we could see if there's something out there that we could, tap to get kind of questions to that. Yeah. Let's see. Any other like research questions that folks think are really important to this? One of the questions I'm interested in is in order for us to score a project, we need to know a certain amount of information about it. And so typically, Matt, I think that's the functional design report, which is pre 25% design, right? And I guess my question is, going back to kind of like at what point do we see this kind of, when do we typically see the biggest jump in cost increase? I think understanding that is actually a really good question. I think that was a John Romano question. So is that between like when we make a decision, functional design report, and then 25% design comes in and that's a big jump? Is it, Ben Muller had identified sometimes it's like the 25 to 75% when those have lagged. I think if we could also understand like where are some of those places where there's a big jump, we could then consider like, do we want to change our rules about when what information we need? Obviously, if we said it has to be at the 25% design level, that's more risk for the municipality to design more and put more time into something without knowing that it'll actually get on the tip. So, understanding those factors. But I think that would be a good one if that's doable, to try to understand at what point does that cost go up, as John was saying. John, do you want to comment on that? Yeah, I see you have your hand raised.
Yeah, Eric, you kind of hit the nail right on the head there, what I was getting at. But, just kind of thinking ahead a little bit, right, using the word risk, right? Maybe we have to incorporate that in our scoring, right? If, let's say we decide that the mark is 25%, we could incorporate a risk factor into our scoring that says if we want to get scored at lower than 25%, then there's some type of risk factor, because we know that the biggest jump is going to happen after the between functional design report at 25%. So we know that maybe there's only a 25% chance that your number's right. So when we're evaluating that to program it on the tip, we say this project has an X risk factor to it. So do we want to program that with that risk factor, or do we want to program this project that's at 25% that has a much lower risk factor of the cost?
Right. Okay. Yeah. And you could even say at the front, and if it, tell us, City of Everett, if, do you want it programmed now? But if the cost goes up, you're on the hook.
Or you're off the tip, right? If you go over 10 million, you're off, but
Yeah.
you want to wait and,
Yeah, that's
it's
interesting.
something to think about,
Yeah, right. Yeah, Len Diggins.
Yes, in terms of research, I would say it might be helpful to talk to some of our own municipalities, planners in other municipalities, and find out how they feel about the process that we currently have. Is it working for them? What would they like to see done differently? And to the extent that we start formulating some ideas, more concrete ideas about how we want to change things, we should definitely circle back to them and get their feedback on it, whether it be one-on-one with members of the staff or focus groups. That's it. Thanks.
Okay. Jay?
I just want to follow up on John's comment. I agree with everything he said. I think, if you look at today, the functional design report is an at-risk effort by the town, right? It's done before the project gets scored by anybody, before the MPO commits to funding it. And I think it's a good exercise for any project proponent to do at risk. It's probably 1%, if not less, of the total project cost. And then I think that's a good, stopping point to say, okay, now we have a chance to this is where the MPO would fund some portion of the remaining design and sort of take it away from the town a little bit, to kind of take that that element of risk out for the town, but also to have a more fair discussion about whether it's worth the, whatever the cost is ultimately, is it worth that cost? Still leaving the initial act of proposing the project to the city or town, putting a little bit of effort up front on them, but then taking that burden off of them for some period of time while you really evaluate the project and while you really figure out, does the cost benefit work out?
Yeah. Yeah, there's kind of a chicken and egg thing there, right? Like, do you use design to advance the project? But yeah, no, I see what you're saying. Catherine.
Thank you for taking another public comment. I just wanted to offer a couple thoughts as you all are deliberating so thoughtfully. With respect to equity, I'm certainly aware that Belmont is often referred to as a wealthy white community, and certainly we have a dominant demographic of white residents. But I do want you to consider, as you're thinking these things through, a project like Trapello Road, which was not funded by the town, though the town certainly contributed to it throughout the process. But if that had not been funded, I think it would have really impacted the portion of the community that is most dependent on public transportation. And so when you think about equity, take those factors into consideration, not just just who might be impacted and who may be how the community may be expanding itself by virtue of projects that are being funded. And then lastly, I just would add, I really appreciate some of the comments that you're making about process. And I think those would be welcome kind of milestones and aspects to fold into the process, because I think certainly as a committee member, I felt the tension between, conceding some aspects of a design to enable greater support from the community, but recognize that they may be sort of nice to haves as opposed to critical needs in a project. So I definitely see that coming up. But yeah, so thank you. And I'll look forward to contributing more offline and seeing how you guys develop this. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Steve Onoff.
Hi. It just occurred to me that, every time we have a project, we just get one number. We just get the cost. We don't get any details. It's broken down and how it's in the early stages, how many lane miles of roadway at, so many dollars per mile, and we can see it multiplied out and see some of the numbers, and so much for police details, so much for other things. And then, because then when the price goes up, we're just given another number saying, oh, it went up by X amount of dollars. And if we could take the first shot and see the second shot and say, okay, here's where it went up, we could have a better understanding of, why is the cost increasing, and better make a decision. It might be too much detail for some people, but I think, the people at the MPO are, can do that.
Thank you, Steve. I mean, my understanding is that all that information is available, that all that information is, is with, comes to CTPS, that's in the functional design report. There are obviously, that's a ton of detail, and I don't know how fruitful it would be to kind of at meetings go through those, line by line, but that information is available. And
yeah, but the problem, it's not easily available to MPO members in an easy form to look at. Maybe, and so where do you get to it? We're never really given, you don't have to, I don't want to go searching for it every time I want to look for it. And in fact, I would have a hard time even knowing where to start to look for that. So maybe that could be made simplified form available more easily to members of the MPO.
Yeah. Well, certainly, I think to some of the points that were made today, like, investigating more about just trying to understand like what why did this project go up in cost, and kind of going back to John Romano's point about then understanding, was this scope creep? Was this within the cost of the scope? Was it, is it external things like the cost of steel that we just can't, world issues that we don't control, those kinds of things.
Every time it goes up, we get an explanation, but it's always a little fuzzy to me. It's not enough detail that I can really appreciate why it went up.
Yeah.
And if we could see some numbers really, those individual numbers really change. Is it do they make the road wider? Are they paving more miles? Are they, what's going on here? So that, we just get a good idea. We don't need to go down to too much a level of detail, but just enough to really see the components involved.
Thank you, Steve. So I think I just want to be mindful of time. Are there any sort of final comments about or question or things that folks think like would be nice to research, or questions that would be really important to research so we could try to bring back to the next meeting? Ben?
Yeah, I was just looking through the analysis we did last year. And this is something I can talk offline with Matt a little bit about as well. But it looked like the most helpful analysis for us was looking at all the projects that advertised in the last federal fiscal year, and then looking at when they met their design milestones and what their cost was over time and what their sort of program description was. Because once we had sort of that information in a nice spreadsheet, we could put together some helpful charts for interpreting where projects might have, changed wildly in cost or been delayed dramatically, or how long they even took. But I can share that with you, Matt, if that would be helpful.
Yeah, I think that kind of information would be very helpful. Obviously, if there's readily available information, we can bring that back in a timely manner to a meeting, then that's great. If this is like a huge research project that's going to take months to do, we also need to, I think, understand that, just because that affects our ability then to be able to make decisions on I think a timeline that folks want to be able to do something for the next tip cycle. I haven't heard, unless someone says differently, I think that's what we're trying to run on here. Okay, so I feel like we've talked a lot about what we think what the issue is here. I think we've documented things around cost estimating and cost control incentives and project oversight, the role that design could fund, value engineering, cost sharing, a number of things, even Brian's point about potentially even a policy to try to spread, funding and cover more projects by having cost sharing and basing it on some type of, project scoring criteria. So I think we have a number of topics here. We also have a number of questions around data and research that could help inform some of this. So I think what we need to do is kind of take this back a little bit with staff and kind of discuss a little bit about what we can kind of focus on for the next meeting. But I would say, to me, I think the next meeting is now we've kind of identified these issues, and now it's trying to drill down a little bit into these with some of these research topics, and try to identify, where do we think some of the, again, what are some of the things that we might have direct control over as an NPO, and things that might be more like, recommendations, or how we want to actually, what does it mean to implement a policy at the NPO? So let's talk about just timing. Is that the next topic area? You want to advance the slide? So how frequently should the committee meet? What are the best days and times to meet? My thinking has been that if we really do want to come up with some recommendations, we probably need to have those by like the end of the summer, early, in September, if we make a recommendation to the full board, and if we, if we are actually implementing like a policy, I mean, it could be as something as firm as an actual, like, here's a written policy that we're going to present to the full MPO that we want to adopt that will guide how we address cost increases in the future. It could also be something looser than that. It could be like, best practices that, are looser. I mean, that's something we can think about. But I think that if we are looking to actually make a recommendation and kind of get it out into the, get it out there for the public and for cities and towns, I think we need to do that. What would you say, Matt Genova? Like, get that out, have a public comment or have a process so that people are well aware of that in, like, by November, December?
Yeah, I would say, bringing something back to the full board by sometime in September, I think is a good target. And then, yeah, if we allow for, 21 days, 30 days, whatever it may be for a public comment period, engage municipalities more. Yeah, I think shooting for end of October, early November to have something formalized is probably like a solid target for now. And then as sort of came up in the discussion, I mean, we can do some engagement of municipalities and other stakeholders in the region throughout the process as well. So, we're not just sort of dropping things on folks at the last minute. So that can help sort of mitigate, help give us maybe a little bit more wiggle room in the timeline. But yeah, I think your timeline makes sense.
I mean, we're at the beginning of June. I think we probably need to meet at the very least a couple more times over the course of the summer. Why don't we, I think it would be better for everyone's schedule if we can plan those out in advance. In general, do folks like to meet on the same day that we have an MPO meeting, like right afterwards?
As long as there aren't 3 meetings that day. So I can do 2. I just can't do it with.
You can't do a UPWP meeting and right.
And then the PO meeting and then this one, but yeah, Thursdays in general work well for me,
Yeah.
And
I typically kind of carve out most of Thursday as an MPO day. Do Thursdays work for most people? Raise your hand if not. Otherwise,
Maybe we could do do you want to do it with like the actual raise hand function so we could see?
Yeah. Raise your hand if Thursdays, if Thursdays do not work. Okay, I think Thursdays work for people. Do people like after an MPO meeting or kind of, afternoon as opposed, I feel like in the morning, it's just so, trying to do something before an MPO meeting, there's not enough time.
Can we do during, Eric?
Have a side meeting. Okay, so let's think about, on a Thursday, in the afternoon, maybe after an MPO meeting, if there isn't already an ANF or a UPWP meeting, and we'll put out we'll work with staff to put out, I think, like an agenda for the summer. I think it's better even to schedule meetings, even if we then don't need them and we can cancel them. I just think for the summer with people's vacation and things like that, at least getting them on the calendar is good to do.
I agree.
Okay. We have, John Romano.
Eric, so David was talking about us possibly not having an MPO meeting on the 17th of June. So if that's the case, maybe we could use that time, starting at 10, and maybe having a longer, maybe a little longer meeting instead of waiting till, 12:30 or 1 to have it.
That could work. I mean, that's 2 weeks. Let's, we need to have an agenda setting meeting on Monday to figure that out. But let me just get a sense, would that work for everyone? Since probably most people have that on their calendar anyways.
I already had that blocked.
Yeah. Okay. I getting a thumbs up. So let's see. And if that's the case, we could do a longer meeting and try to, maybe cover more. Now that's only 2 weeks. So I don't know if we would have the ability to do all of this kind of research that was proposed before then. We just have to see what the staff capacity, is to be able to do that. But I think at the very least, we could shoot for the next meeting being June 17th.
And we can discuss.
That's a,
No, please go, Eric.
I'll ask a quick planning question. So if we do have ANF and we do have an MPO meeting, would we want to keep have like the TIP committee meeting after that? Like, should we have like a plan B just in case there is an MPO meeting? Like, if you want to keep it, but that is 3 meetings that day, and you stated that that may not work for members.
Yeah, plan B could be the 24th.
I just can't do the second Thursdays because I have outdoor advertising hearings on that Thursday. So as long as it's not the second Thursday, Thursdays are good for me.
Works for me.
Would the 24th be a backup that works for people? Maybe like like at 12:30?
Yeah.
Okay,
Anytime
so
on the-
that'll be our backup then for the next meeting. Great. Any other members' items, final comments?
We're going to plan out more meetings. I thought you were going to like plan out the rest, and then maybe not use them if you didn't.
Yeah,
'Cause-
what I was thinking of doing was sitting down with staff and looking at the calendar, and then
Okay.
we can then do that online.
I got you.
Put it in
I got
email
it.
out.
Yeah. And I might even suggest maybe a couple in July and then taking August off and then one in September. But just thought.
Yeah, we could see. Annette?
So another thing to consider is if we do have a meeting on the 17th, it is likely to be a very short meeting because we don't have much for that agenda. So that's an option as well.
Yes, I think right now we're looking at either the 17th or the 24th, depending on what the MPO agenda looks like. It seems like that those dates work for people if it's not too busy on the 17th. Great. Okay. Any other comments or final points? Okay, great. This was a great first meeting. I think we really did a good job, digging into this, and I look forward to discussing more. Thank you all.
Thanks, Eric.
So, bye.
Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.